My Gavan and Melonin, and well met indeed. I'm Arachir Galadirthan, head of the modding team behind Divide and Conquer, and welcome to a guide on unit stats for modding of Medieval 2 Total War. This will be the first in a new set of videos replacing the older guides I did some years ago. Not necessarily because anything has changed, but just to improve the quality of those and to touch on some new aspects of modding that I didn't before. Today's video will detail just all the information you need about how units are created and what stats you can edit and you can play around within the files to change a unit to see to how you see fit. So today and for all videos henceforth, you will almost certainly want to download and use Notepad++ in order to deal with any of the files we're going to deal with today. Notepad++ is a better version of Notepad, which comes stock with Windows, of course, and it is highly recommended. And indeed, if you're modifying DAC, it is actually necessary, but if you're modifying other mods, it's just highly recommended as it has some excellent features, and you will simply just need to download and run that. Once you have done that, it's then a case of navigating to where you've got the game installed, because that's where all the files are. That's where all the modding takes place. If you have the game on Steam, it'll be Steam, Steam Apps Common, Medieval 2 Total War, Mods, and then whichever mod you want to edit or change. If you have the game on disc, then it's Sega, Creative Assembly, Medieval 2 Total War, Mods. It's a similar path, it just starts with Sega rather than Steam. Once you've found the mod that you want to edit, you need to go into the data folder, and then this is every single file that will change anything about the mod. They're all stored here. We're dealing with units today, so there are only 3 files and 1 folder that we're interested in. The first is the export descript unit folder here in the data folder. You will want to open that. That contains all the actual stats. Second, go to the text folder and open the file export_units, which is listed just here. That contains the unit's name and its description. Lastly, go back into the data folder and go to unit_models. Once in there, open the battle models model DB, which we shall throughout this video call the BMDB. You need all 3 of those open, and like Blue Peter, here's one I've prepared earlier. The export descript unit, or the EDU, the export units, which is always just called export units, and the BMDB. These are the 3 files needed to change any kind of unit around. And the unit that we have chosen today as our subject are the Eldrinwe Roquen for Imladris in Divide and Conquer. So I am generally just going to run through what all of these stats do and what changing them actually means for you and your game, and then of course how they implement and affect with the other 2 files. I will put some timestamps in the video detailing when we're dealing with like the description of the unit, the combat stats of the unit, or they'll be broken down into various categories that I've actually not yet decided on, so that's why what I've just said is probably wrong. But the Eldrinwe Roquen is the unit we're using. Now this is a cavalry unit, and I can show you as well a little later on what a ranged unit's stats would look like, just so that you can see the difference between range and so you can get a feel of all the entire unit. Although while I'm saying that, actually, why not use the Dunedain Scouts? Because they are a cavalry archer, which means they have every stat available. So yes, we're going to use Dunedain Scouts because they're a cavalry archer, so everything is on show. Right, so without any further ado, let's dive in. So the first 2 things that you see, of course, are the type and the dictionary. Now, these are the names of the unit in the files. The dictionary entry is only used in 2 locations. Number 1 is the export units folder. So if we take that, we copy it, and we go into this area and we search for what we've just copied, it'll take us to Dunedain_Scouts. So that is how the game finds the description and the name for this unit between the 2 files using the dictionary entry. And here you can see Dunedain Scouts is their in-game name, and then their description follows afterwards, and then lastly you get their short description, which appears on the recruitment scroll that pops up in the game. And you can edit those to your heart's content. The only thing to note about editing that is that there's no such thing as paragraph breaks. You can't just press enter and hope that it'll appear as a break. You have to input these, /n. Each /n denotes a new line. So when you have 2 of them next to each other, that means it will not only have a gap between it and the line before, but it'll be on the line below. Whereas if you just do only the one n/ like you have here, it just means it's on the line below. So that's the only thing to note about that. You'll note that accents work in this folder. You can call units whatever you want, but in order to find the unit, the best way is through the dictionary. The other use of the dictionary is the only other time we're going to come out of Notepad, and that is for the UI. So if you go into the data folder, and there is a folder called UI, which means user interface, and then there is unit info and units, and these two folders dictate what the unit cards will look like. So unit info is the big image that appears when you right click on a unit in battle. If we go to the Turks, who are the Northern Dunedain, and we find the Dunedain_scouts, because again we're looking for that entry that we saw on the EDU, and double click that, it'll show you that that is their unit card. Similarly, if we go back to UI, go to units, again go to Turks, who are the Northern Dunedain, and this time you'll note they're differentiated because they start with a hash. Not really sure why, but I don't know why they did the two files differently, but there we are. And again, you're looking for Dunedain Scouts. Open that and you'll get the small UI image for the Scouts. And those are the only times the dictionary line is used. So you can edit that one fairly easily, and it won't crash the game if you make a mistake with the dictionary line. It just simply won't generate any UI, and the unit won't have a name or a description. The type line is used in all other files. So if you are adding this unit at the start of the game to one of the garrisons of one of the towns, or if you're adding this unit through the campaign script, so there's a scripted event and you want this unit to be spawned, then that is the line that you use. If you're adding this unit to the barracks, then that again is the line that you use. If you're adding this unit to the mercenary file, that's the line that you use. So anywhere else in the files, the type line is where the name is used. And speaking of the barracks, that will all be covered in the buildings overview, which will be the next video. Next down we come to the category and class. Now category and class, we can see that there's differences between them. Infantry, cavalry, that just, when you're hovering over a unit on the battlefield, that'll show you, and it often then denotes underneath it whether it's sort of medium infantry, ranged infantry, cavalry. That's where it takes that from, denoting that this is a cavalry unit. And the class is a missile, so they fire ranged units. I don't think the class has much of a use outside of this file, if I am honest. I can't recall a time where that has actually been of any kind of note. So there are certain types of class that every unit must have. So if you find all in current document, you can see that you've got light, heavy, missile, spearman, and I think that is it as it goes through. So every type of unit is one of those types of things. Next up, you have the voice type, which works better if there are lots of different types of voice, but generally there aren't all that many. And often I believe the voice types, the only options are light and heavy. And it allows you, if you want to have a different type of voice depending on whether a unit is a light or a heavy unit, and indeed also a general unit. But again, that gets into sound editing, which we're not going to really cover in this video, or indeed any of these videos. But if you want to, units can either have, so every culture and every nation in the game can have a light and a heavy version of speaking, and you can apply that there. The accent, again, just is another identifier for the sound files to work out what accent to take it from. Think of it like a folder structure. So first it's going to check, is the voice type light? Yes. And under light, what accent are we using? We're using English. And so you can go through. I am, again, fairly certain that almost every unit in the files uses an accent that... Oh no, there's loads of them. I was going to say they're all English, but no, there are loads of them, because again, it's just like a folder structure, so it applies to the sound files. Banner faction, I am not entirely certain. Oh no, indeed, sorry. That's the hovering banner that will appear over the unit when it is fighting in the battle. Banners are turned off for Divide and Conquer as standard, but if you're modding or editing Medieval 2 for yourself, then the banner faction will dictate whether it's got a cavalry, a missile, or an infantry banner above it. And again, we can show you the breakdowns of the different banner factions. There's main infantry, main spear, main missile, main cavalry. So those are the 4 different types of banners. One will have a sword on it, one will have a spear, one will have an arrow, and one will have a horse. And that's how you get those. The banner holy is what appears on the campaign map when a unit joins the crusade. What will appear above it? And the crusade icon is just a crusade icon, I believe. In Divide and Conquer, it's modded to be an Eye of Sauron, but in the base game, isn't it a big golden cross? And it just dictates what will appear above that unit if it joins a crusade. Right, then we get into the actual bread and butter of the stats. So the first line we're coming to here is the soldier. And this is where the BMDB comes into play, because the soldier line dictates what animations will be used by the unit. So even though the mounted Dunedain Ranger does appear again later, and we'll discuss that in a moment, its entry on the soldier line just means that the animations used by this particular unit will be used for the Dunedain Scouts. And so the reason I mention that is because you could have a unit that swings its axe over its head like a helicopter, for example, but you don't want your unit to look like that unit, but you want it to fight with those animations, and so you would put the unit's animations you wanted here. And where these units are all listed is the BMDB. So if we take that and search for it, and we come to the BMDB and find that unit, this folder is incredibly difficult to edit. I don't actually think it is. It's a very methodical file, because every single line, the entries on the line must be counted, and they must meet that requirement. In that, for example, Mounted Dunedain Rangers is 24 characters in length, so 24 is written next to it. The number 1 is 1 character in length. Unit models unit LOD mesh is 54, so 54 counts. But the 6400 doesn't. I've never really understood why. But anyway, this is the unit's entry in the BMDB. Now, the BMDB's purpose is to give the unit textures, a model, and animations. So this applies only obviously in battle maps. If you do something wrong in this file, the game simply will not start. So be very cautious about editing this file. The first entries that you'll see here, you've got Saxons, Turks, United, and Slave. Those dictate who owns the unit. So if you want your unit to not appear as what we call a silver surfer, you must apply ownership here. But that will be covered again further in a later video. But just note that this is where they're listed. It then lists the different textures that the unit is going to use, any attachments that the unit uses, so whether it's a sword or a spear or a shield or whatever, and finally what sprite is displayed. The first line dictates what battle model is going to be used, or here they're called meshes, but of course it's just the model underneath. So will it look like a troll? Will it look like a human? Will it have elf ears? Will it have 5 arms? All of those things are edited there, and you'd need to be able to actually edit units to change those. And then, as I say, it's textures and attachments. And then lastly, down at the base here are the animations. So the first one dictating that this unit is on a horse, and it uses the bow with no shield animation on a horse. It then has a bow as a primary animation, and its secondary animation is a sword. So these are the animations that we are using when we change the soldier line. It's then dictating that it's using that specific set of animations. Right, the next one is the number of units in the battalion. So if you play the game on normal unit sizes, there will be 24 men in the Dunedain Scout Battalion. If you play on huge, which DAC does as standard, then times that number by 2.5 and you get the size. So 2.5 times of that is what, 48, 12, 60? Yes, so 60 units, 24 is 60 men on the battlefield in a huge setup. Do note that the maximum number of a unit size in this file is 100, and the smallest number is 4. You cannot have a battalion with less than 4 people in it, so watch out for that. The next number is only used for siege units, and it dictates how many attachments they will have. So if this were a catapult unit and it had a 2 there, it would mean they have 2 catapults on the battlefield. I don't know the maximum number that can be there, but I know you can have 1. 2 to 4 is normally quite common. I would have thought 10 probably is the maximum, but I'm not entirely certain. And lastly, the final number there is the mass of the unit. So 1 is obviously the standard, and anything higher than a 1 gives that unit a very high mass, which allows them to punch deeper into enemy lines and also not take as much damage when they are charged by another unit. So obviously a higher mass is always better and a lower mass is worse. I think the lowest, I don't think it can be 0, but I believe it can be lower than 1. Next up is the officer line, and this is just the gentlemen that stand on the left-hand side of every battalion on the battle map. You can have at maximum 2 officers, and you can set them to whatever you want. Now, the entry used for the officer here is again taken from the Battle Models database file. So the ND Captain Early flag only appears in the BMDB, and that is just the Northern Dunedain flag banner carrier. But it can be anything you want, and to change it to another unit, For example, if you wanted to change it to be a unit that's actually present in the game, so if we wanted Dunedain Blade Masters to be the officer, we would take their armor upgrade model line and we would apply that to our officer. So it's very easily amended and very easily changed, and all of the entries must be taken from the BMDB, but do note that the BMDB entries are also listed in the armor upgrade models, and we'll get to those in a moment and detail them further. Next up is what type of mount does it use, and each individual mount is listed in the descript mounts file. So if you go back to your folder and go back to data, I didn't think we'd need another one, but there will actually be 2 other files we're going to deal with, I think, in truth. And we want to go to descript mounts. They're in alphabetical order, but it always throws me off. Descript mount, there we are. And we can open that, and here every single unit will be listed. Now, I'm not going to go into detail about how to edit and change horses. You can just look through here and find a horse that you may want to use, and you can replace it in. So this one uses the Northern Heavy Horse, so we go to the descript mount. We look for Northern Heavy Horse, and there it is. There's various other types of horses: Swan Guard Horse, Royal Swan Guard, Nazgul Horse, Kind Horse, Merchant Horse, etc. You can use whichever one you want, but you must assign ownership to them, as we will discuss in another video about moving units between factions. Of course, the mount only applies to ranged units, so to cavalry, sorry. So for example, the Dunedain Ranger, which is an infantry, does not have a mount because it doesn't have a mount. It's not a cavalry force. So that's a cavalry specific line. The mount effect, the next line down, that applies regardless of whether or not it's cavalry, and it's how much extra damage do you do to other mounts. So the Dunedain Scouts have a +1 bonus against other horses. So any other cavalry unit, they get a bonus. They get a +3 bonus against wargs, which is the Mount Light Wolf. And they get a +3 bonus against the Warg Camel, which is the heavy camel, or the heavy warg, which is used by Moria only. So they get a big bonus against wargs, and they get a small bonus against other horses. I'm not entirely certain what +1 actually means. I don't know if it's an extra attack against that mount, or if it's just they have a 10% better overall fighting quality against that mount. I've never really been certain. But numbers between 1 and 5 are the most you'll ever really see in here. So I think it may just be a direct attack bonus. But again, do not quote me on that. Next up then we come to the attributes, which affect quite a lot. So I list through the ones that we've got here, but then I can, in the link below, I will link to a very, very useful thread on Total War Center, which is basically a text version of everything I'm telling you. And you can go and read that, and it lists all of the attributes. But the ones that we have here, seafaring means that it can board ships, so you can travel it to and from land on board boats. Hide improved forest means that it will hide in only a very small amount of trees. It doesn't need a large forest to hide. Very hardy is the stamina. These options are simply hardy or very hardy, or don't put anything there at all. So there's only 3 tiers of stamina, which is ridiculous. Can withdraw means it is allowed to retreat, the clue's in the name. Free upkeep means that unit will get free upkeep if you can train it in a certain settlement. So some units you can just simply never allow free upkeep to, and I believe the base game does do that. Knight units, I think, don't get free upkeep ever, but citizenry style units do, if memory serves. And Cantabrian Circle is unique to horses, of course, and that allows them to form the Cantabrian Circle. This is also where you get things like legionary name. If you really don't like the legionary system that DAC uses, you can just simply search for the legionary name in the files, and you could, for for example, remove the replace with line and replace all, and then every single legionary unit in the game will lose its name. Will lose its legionary name anyway. But that's where that is dictated. Also, if a unit is a mercenary, which we'll cover in more detail in the mercenary folder, that also is listed in the attributes. But lastly, the one that's worthwhile mentioning here is stakes, because they also get added on the attribute line. So if you want a unit to be able to place stakes, regardless of whatever type of unit it is, even cavalry can place stakes if you wish it, you simply add a stakes line at the end. Do note that they're all separated by a comma, but you don't need a comma for the final one. But if you don't add a comma between entries, then I might not break the game, but certainly those 2 entries simply won't work. So that is how you add stakes if you're interested. Move speed mod is something we talk about a lot in Divide and Conquer, because it is how much faster or slower a unit can be, with 1 being simply the norm. You don't actually need this line at all. So if you don't put this line in, their speed will be 1. There will be no change to it. But you can update it or make them faster or slower as you see fit. So this unit is 5% faster than anything else. If it were 1.1, it would be 10% faster. If it were 0.8, it would be 20% slower. Do you understand how the file works? So that's a very simple line to change. Next up, we come to formation, and this dictates the spacing between the individual men on the battlefield. So the first two numbers, the first number is what's the meter spacing between them side to side. The next number is what is the meter spacing between them front to back. Then the next two are the same stats, but when the formation is in loose formation. And lastly, the final number 3 shows the default number of ranks the battalion will have on the battlefield. So this is a cavalry unit, so almost all cavalry units have 3 ranks because they don't have very many men. But you could set that to be up to 10 if you wanted, but because there's only about 60 people in the battalion, that leaves them with 6 men per rank, so not ideal. And lastly, horde is an attribute that allows you to set whether or not they form a square formation or whether they're just in a large sort of bunched up circle. And the differences here are square or horde. Those are the only options under formation. Do note, though, that there's also a setting called phalanx, which you see here, and also shield wall is applied here. And these are, as they say on the tin, so the shield wall is if you want an infantry unit to be able to form a shield wall, then you add shield wall after the entry. So here we have horde, we're a cavalry unit, we'd never add shield wall, but you can do to any unit that you want to have shield wall. And lastly, if it is a pike unit, you can add the phalanx entry. So this is Anphalas pikemen. You add the phalanx entry, and then it gives them the special ability that allows them to go into pike wall. You can add that if you want to halberdiers, and I think possibly even spearmen as well, but whether or not it actually really affects spearmen is anyone's guess. But it is certainly something that you can add. Next up, we come to stat health. Let's move our bookmark. Stat health. The first number is the number of hit points that the unit has. So things like trollmen, for example, of course, have much greater hit points, but most units have 1. As you can see as we scroll down the file, almost every single unit has 1. The second number is completely irrelevant and has no benefit, but there is some suggestion that it applies in auto-resolve. And on that basis, we've kind of hoped that it does, and we've given all cavalry a much higher number, but there's no actual real grounded foundation for that. But it is suggested that the higher that number, the better the unit in auto-resolve. But otherwise, it's not really used for anything. Right, then we come to combat stats, starting with the primary attack of the unit. So this is a cavalry archer, so their primary attack is obviously a bow. Their primary missile damage is 5, and the second one is always their charge, even though it's a bow. So the cavalry unit's charge is a 4 when it has its bow equipped, and we could, if we wanted, then changed it so that when it has its sword equipped, its charge increases to, say, 6 or whatever. But the first one is always the primary attack of the first weapon, and then the stat sec is the primary attack of the secondary weapon. So this obviously is a cavalry archer, so the first weapon is a bow, the second is a sword. Next up, you then dictate if they have a bow. This is for bow only. Then you can see, you then put in what type of arrow do they use. And this takes us to the other file that I was mentioning, the last one we should hope to use, which is the descript projectile in the data folder. And this is where every single arrow in the game is used and is listed. So canned horse archer arrow is one of the best horse archer arrows, because this dictates, you can add an extra damage bonus to arrows if you want. You can also make the radius and the mass of the arrow larger so that it hits a larger area and that it punches harder against the enemy unit. So if the mass is very, very, very high, the arrow may even knock over the enemy unit. And then you can set the accuracy of the unit, or the accuracy of the arrow against units. And do note that the lower the number, the more accurate it is. So a value of 0 would be 100% accurate, and a value of 1 would be atrocious. The arrows are just completely missing all the time. So you'll note that in the horse archer arrows, there are only 3 in Divide and Conquer because I like uniformity and order. So the horse archer arrow is the worst at 0.065, then the Candish horse archer is slightly better, and then the elves are again slightly better. But note that it's only very minor increments, there's no real giant changes. It also allows you to say whether or not the arrow is worsened by rain, so you could take the affected by rain away, and then arrows fly freely no matter what. And then the minimum angle and the maximum angle affects how far the arrow will fly. Because if we jump back to the EDU, the next number here after the arrow is the range in meters. So it's a 120 meter range, but they can only fire that range if you then line up the angles, the minimum and maximum angle. Next up is the number of arrows that the unit will have, so you can change that very easily. So after that, we then come to what type of weapon is it? And so here we have a missile, but you know underneath there's melee, and the options here are missile, melee, thrown, and siege missile. So if it were a javelin, obviously it'd be thrown, and if it's a siege unit, it'd be siege missile. Next, we have missile mechanical, which is the tech type, which doesn't really have very much of an effect on the unit. It might affect how the unit upgrades. So for example, if where there's melee blade, theoretically that means that that unit can be improved at a building that gives a melee weapon bonus. So nothing actually affects missile mechanical, so in practice it doesn't really mean anything, but you generally always list that if you're using an arrow. Then comes the damage type, so the arrow does piercing damage, but in practice, again, this doesn't really seem to actually have much effect. But the types are slashing, blunt, and piercing. But I'm not entirely certain what that actually changes in the game. And I think it's primarily just sound-based, to be honest. And lastly, speaking of sound, we then have where we have none. And this is just the sound type. So you can have spear, sword, axe, mace, knife, and none. You can also have gun sounds, of course, but the none sound just means that the weapon doesn't make any sound when it fires. Then we come to the number at the end, and that's the minimum delay of the attacks in tenths of a second. So it means that regardless of how the animation of the unit works, there is an inputted delay between the firing of each arrow for this unit of 15 tenths of a second, which is obviously negligible basically, and this stat really does not play very much into the game at all, except it's more pertinent with melee units, but it's a very hidden stat that doesn't really play into the game all that much, so do watch out for that. And lastly, the final number is just where a unit has more than one weapon. This one sets the sort of preference, if you will, of those weapons. The stat primary attribute lists any attributes of the weapon. So these can be armor piercing, body piercing, area, which means they attack an area. Body piercing obviously means they hit more than one unit, and armor piercing just means armor piercing. You can also add in this line a spear bonus. The higher the number on the spear bonus, so if it were 8, 9, 10, 11, 12, that means the more damage it will do against cavalry, but the less damage it will do against infantry. And the long pike just denotes that it is a pike unit. Next up then we come to the secondary, and this is all the same except for the secondary weapon. So again, it's the primary attack, it's the charge when using this weapon. Melee weapons obviously don't have any range, so there's no arrow, there's no range, there's no number of missiles. This is obviously a melee weapon. It uses the melee blade. It's piercing because it's a sword. The sound is a sword, so you use the sword sound. There's a 60 tenths of a second delay between attacks. And lastly, it's preferred number 1 when in melee. There are no attributes present on this one, but again, you can assign attributes to both stats. So armor piercing, body piercing, is it a spear? Will it affect a whole area or not? Then lastly, next up, we come to the armor. So stat primary armor, the first is the actual armor of the unit. So that's things that will be affected by armor piercing. And of course, that's the stat that will be factored in no matter what. Next is the defense skill. That is only applied if the unit is attacked, and I think only from the front or the sides. It may well be that it is applied no matter where the unit is attacked, but I'm fairly certain that if you attack them in the back, you negate both of these. And lastly, of course, the shield stat, which only applies if the unit is attacked from the front or the left. The next entry is the sound that is made when you are struck by anything. So this unit has leather listed there. So if a sword hits it or a bow or anything hits it, it will play the leather sound. It can also be flesh, and I think it can also be steel or metal. Sorry, it's metal. So it's flesh, leather, and metal. Stat secondary armor only applies for siege units and is literally just the health and the armor of the siege unit, so you won't really need to edit that at all. Stat heat applies an extra fatigue debuff to units when fighting in deserts. So this unit, you will see there's a 2, so its fatigue is reduced twice as fast in deserts. Stat ground applies on different types of ground. How effective is this unit on the 4 different types of ground? So the first one is scrub, the second one is sand, the third is forest, and the fourth is snow. Then we come to the morale of the unit. So stat mental, 16 is its morale stat. This is the hidden value that you never see. The highest morale stat we've ever used really is around 30. and we use that for the unwavering. So the second one, Disciplined, deals with morale shocks against the unit. How well do they deal with bad things happening, a general dying or flank attacks or things like that? Disciplined is quite a high one, with the options being low, normal, disciplined, and impetuous. And if it's impetuous, they may charge without orders, but also they deal with shocks the best. And lastly, you can have untrained, trained, or highly trained, and this applies to how well the unit stays in cohesion when it's in its formation. The charge distance is how far away will the unit be from the enemy before they start charging. Stat Food is another completely obsolete entry, so you can completely ignore that. Stat Cost is indeed now where we get to the actual cost. There's quite a lot of lines, but don't worry about that. The first entry is how many turns does it take to train this unit in the campaign. It costs 865 gold coins to buy, and its upkeep is 240. The next two stats are how much does it cost to upgrade the unit's weapons, how much does it cost to upgrade the unit's armor, and then it comes to custom battle. So in custom battle it costs 865 gold coins. You can train 3 of them before the cost of the unit increases, and once it increases by 80 coins per unit. So those last 3 are custom battle only. The middle 2 apply in custom battle and on the campaign, and the first 3 are campaign only. Armor upgrade levels details what tiers of armor the unit can upgrade at. So this one starts at armor tier 2. It can upgrade then to 3, 4 and 5 because you can only upgrade 3 times. Do note that in the blacksmith building, as we'll cover in the buildings overview, that then dictates which tier of armor that blacksmith upgrades at. So the first blacksmith will upgrade from 0 to 1, then the next one from 1 to 2, 2 to 3, 3 to 4, etc. So this one won't get any use out of the first or second blacksmith. It needs the third one before it can even upgrade its armor. The next line then dictates what the unit will actually look like. This is its textures. So where before we've already mentioned that the soldier dictates the animations that the unit will use, and indeed the sort of skeleton that the unit will use. This one dictates what the unit will look like. And these can be changed depending on what tier of blacksmith you are at. That is how armor upgrades work. So you'll note that at tier 2, at the start of the game, it looks like a mounted Dunedain Ranger. But then at 3, 4 and 5, it upgrades to look like Bowmasters. Now these entries are, again, you guessed it, stored in the BMDB. So that is the mounted Dunedain Ranger entry. You can have a unit look like anything you want, provided that the skeletons align, because of course you set the skeleton here at the soldier tier and the animations here at the soldier tier, but then the visuals, the textures come at the upgrade models section. So, and what I mean by that is you could put a unit in there that's a two-handed swordman, and then put a unit in there that is a sword and shield unit, and then it will wield on the battlefield its sword and its shield in a two-handed sword animation, so it will look very bizarre. The Bowmasters are also, of course, listed in the BMDB, and it's always just that name there. Next up, then we come, of course, to ownership. So you'll note that the first tier, the first line of this dictates who can own that unit at all. So this applies obviously in custom battle, and if you ever need the unit in campaign. So the Turks, United, the Rebels, who are slave, and the Saxons, who are the High Elves, they can all own this unit. But in order to train them in the campaign, they must then be available at one of the 3 eras. Now, really, we actually only need, I think, Era 0, because we never change eras in Divide and Conquer. But in the base game, there are different eras. And so you'll note that for us, for all eras, the Northern Dunedain and the High Elves can always train this unit. But you'll note that Rebels and the United can't actually train this unit, but they do own the unit. And there's a key distinction there. It just means that if the unit is scripted into that faction as a one-off gift, for example, it won't appear as a Silver Surfer on the battle map, and worse yet, it will actually appear. So if United didn't have this ownership entry, and a Dunedain scout unit was spawned for them, the unit just simply wouldn't exist in the game. So you'd be expecting to get your scout unit and nothing would happen. You have to give it ownership. And then these ones just allow you to say, yes, that unit can also be trained by that faction. And then finally, to end this video, the recruit priority offset is just how much do you want the AI to train that unit. And the higher that number, the more priority the unit is given in its recruitment. So that is how all of the stats play out. So from this video alone, you can tinker with the damage of any unit, you can change the charge rates, their armor stats, how much do they cost, how much is their upkeep, what's their morale like, what do they actually look like. But as I say, in the next episode, whenever that will be, we will deal with how the buildings work. So how do you train these units in game? What effects can you give to certain buildings? And just all things related to buildings. And thereafter, if you want to learn how to swap units between factions or import units from another mod, that will be dealt with in its own video as well. So I hope this has been helpful. Please do post any comments you've got in the questions down below. As I update each of these videos, I will remove the older ones from the list because they are awful to listen to for my ears. They're damaging to listen to. So I'll remove the older ones as we update these newer ones. But if you have any questions, please do post them in the comments below. And otherwise, until we speak again, dear friends, Navarne den per Melonin, and farewell.